You are about to understand why your greatest strength may be destroying you from the inside, and why no one ever warned you about it. There is a type of mind that sees what no one else sees. The tension before the fight, the intention behind the smile, the ending before the beginning. If you have that kind of mind, this video is about the price it charges, and about what no personality book has ever told you. Because no one talks about the exhaustion of never being able to turn it off, about the loneliness of arriving at conclusions that others are not ready to hear, about the exact moment when perception stops being an advantage and starts being an invisible prison. That is what we are going to open up here, with the honesty this subject demands and with the respect you deserve. There is a scene that many people with this profile recognize without needing any explanation. A child at a family dinner sitting at the table among the adults. No one fought. No one raised their voice. The meal goes on with its usual normalcy. Plates, conversations about nothing, the predictable sound of silverware against dishes. But she feels it. Before any word is spoken, before any explicit gesture, before any visible change in anyone's face, she feels that something is wrong, that there is a tension beneath the normalcy, like pressure building under a surface that has not yet given way. The adults are smiling. She knows the smiles are fake. She cannot prove it. She has no words to describe it. She just knows, with a certainty that lives in the body before it reaches the mind. That child grows up, and the ability does not disappear with childhood. It deepens with every experience, refines itself with every pattern that is confirmed over time, learns to organize itself into reading systems that become more sophisticated, more precise, and also more demanding. The person who is born this way learns to read silences as if they were texts full of meaning, to hear what is not said with the same attention that most people reserve for what is said out loud, to perceive patterns and behaviors that seem completely random and disconnected to anyone on the outside. She does not do this intentionally. It is a way of being in the world, constant, involuntary, relentless, and profoundly lonely in ways that she herself often cannot articulate clearly enough for anyone around her to truly understand. Carl Gustav Jung was one of the few thinkers in history who took this type of mind seriously as a real psychological category, not as eccentricity, not as a pathology to be treated, not as self-indulgence from someone who prefers to feel special. In his theory of personality, developed over decades of intensive clinical work, Jung described the introverted intuitive as the type oriented toward the inner world of images, possibilities, and deep structures that sustain visible reality without being seen by most people. Not through logic, which organizes what already exists. Not through sensation, which faithfully registers what is present and tangible. But through the direct perception of patterns that have not yet become visible to others. Of movements that are still forming in the layers below what is commonly perceptible. Jung described this type as possessing a penetrating, almost prophetic vision, capable of grasping what is forming before it forms, what is unraveling before it visibly collapses for everyone, what exists as potential before it becomes concrete fact. But Jung was also honest about the cost that accompanies this way of perceiving. Practical reality, deadlines, everyday obligations, the functional details of things that simply need to get done, tends to slip through the introverted intuitive's hands, not for lack of ability, but because their attention naturally inhabits another plane of experience. They see far, and those who see far almost always stumble over what is close. This shows up in very practical ways that the introverted intuitive easily recognizes. The deadline that passed because the mind was mapping long-term implications while the immediate due date was forgotten. The commitment that was canceled because all the energy was directed toward processing a conversation from yesterday that still has not fully closed. The bill that fell behind because the focus was on another level of reality, one that feels more important, more profound, more real, but that the surrounding world still demands be managed. these are small, practical failures that accumulate, and to those on the outside, they look like carelessness or lack of commitment. On the inside, the experience is different. It is not negligence, it is a mismatch of speeds. Yet the world demands attention to the immediate at the same frequency that the mind inhabits the deep, and sustaining both at once carries a cost that few people see from the outside. This is not self-indulgence. It is an honest description of a mind that operates in a specific way, with specific gifts and with vulnerabilities that are inseparable from those very gifts. Understanding both sides clearly and honestly is the only real starting point for any path worth walking. The gifts need to be named with precision before we get into what they cost. Validating what exists is the first step, not to stay there, but to move beyond it on solid ground. When this profile is functioning well, this is the kind of person who walks into a meeting and within 15 minutes has already understood the power dynamics that took months to form, who listens to a presentation and identifies the unspoken assumption that will cause the plan to fail, who talks with someone for half an hour and knows with reasonable precision what that person needs to hear, what motivates them, and what they are avoiding admitting. These are not abstract superpowers. They are real abilities with real value in the world. When they are integrated, when they are not being used purely for self-protection, when they are not overwhelming the person who carries them. The introverted intuitive has an extraordinary ability to read intentions that goes far beyond what people describe when they talk about reading people. It is not mysticism. It is a rapid synthesis that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The mind integrates micro-expressions that last fractions of a second, minimal variations in tone of voice, behavioral patterns accumulated over time, inconsistencies between what is said and what is done that go completely unnoticed by most people, subtle shifts in the quality of someone's attention, and it produces a conclusion that the person experiences as a feeling, as a gut sense. It is information processing operating at a speed and depth far above what conscious thought can follow or explain in a linear way. I understand that it can be hard to accept that something so central to your identity also has a trap side, especially when this perception has been, for a long time, your way of navigating the world with some advantage. But it is still worth listening. They anticipate consequences that others do not see, and often do not even consider relevant yet. And they can trace how a decision made today will ripple out over weeks, months, sometimes years. Not because they are pessimistic by nature, but because they have mapped the underlying dynamics with enough precision to project their likely unfolding. They perceive group dynamics before they manifest as visible conflict. They feel when a friendship is hollowing out before a single word is exchanged about it. That lunch where everyone is excited about the new project, and you are sitting in silence because you have already seen where it is going to end, and you have to pretend you do not know. That is real, and it is a weight that most people around you simply do not carry. And they carry all of this frequently alone, in prolonged silence, because they tried to explain a few times and the result was being seen as overly negative. As someone who unnecessarily complicates things, as someone who just cannot simply trust. They have a deep symbolic sensitivity that transforms the everyday into something different from what it is for most people. The world speaks to them in patterns, metaphors, and connections that cut across seemingly unrelated domains, and that to others appear to be leaps without logic. A song evokes an emotional structure they recognize from a conversation that happened 3 years ago. A dream processes a conflict that their mind has not yet named, but that will be clearly recognizable days later. An image found by chance carries meanings they feel with intensity before they can put it into words. They think in patterns and possibilities before they think in specific facts and surface-level manifestations. All of this is real. All of it has genuine and irreplaceable value that the world needs in ways it often does not know how to name. And all of it carries a cost that most people systematically underestimate, including the introverted intuitive themselves, who are often so absorbed in perceiving the world around them that they forget to notice what this continuous process of perception is doing to them over time, silently, without visible drama. Because seeing too much is exhausting in a way that no other word captures precisely. I know it is hard to hear this about something that has been, for a long time, your way of positioning yourself in the world and feeling useful. But the constant and involuntary perception is not only an active gift you switch on when you need it. It is also a passive load that runs all the time, without being called, without asking permission, without stopping while you sleep. Every conversation is processed on multiple layers at once, even when you are exhausted. Every silence carries weight and needs to be interpreted, even when you would rather not interpret anything. Every shift in tone is registered and filed away, even when all you wanted was to be present without analyzing anything. That WhatsApp group you have had muted for weeks because checking in drains you more than it helps. That is not being oversensitive. That is the system working when you needed rest. There is something that accompanies this exhaustion and is rarely talked about: the invisible social cost. The introverted intuitive who is exhausted from perceiving does not stop perceiving. They simply begin relating to what they perceive from a different place, more distant, and more defensive. Conversations get shorter, responses get vaguer. Presence starts to diminish before anyone around them notices what is happening. And then, when someone finally asks, "Are you okay?" the honest answer would be so long and so hard to explain that it seems easier to say, "I'm just tired." But it is not just tired. It never was. The way this mind works has no off switch. And the result, over time, months, years, decades, is an exhaustion that has no easy name. It is different from physical tiredness, different from sadness, different from the kind of anxiety that a weekend fixes. It is the specific and cumulative exhaustion of a mind that never truly stops, that is always, on some level, reading the surrounding environment, processing what it picks up, trying to make sense of what it perceives, now organizing into patterns what arrives as a continuous stream. This exhaustion is silent in a way that makes it especially hard to recognize. No one asks for it to exist. There is no dramatic event that produces it all at once. It is the gradual and invisible accumulation of years spent processing what others do not process, without that being seen or acknowledged. Carrying information no one asked for and that often no one wants to hear, without anyone to truly share that weight with. Because sharing would require explaining in a way the other person could genuinely understand, and that rarely happens. And when it does not happen, it produces its own frustration that adds to the original weight. And here is one of the most specific and least talked about wounds of this profile: the loneliness of those who see too soon. It is not the loneliness of someone who was explicitly abandoned or rejected. It is a structurally different loneliness. The loneliness of someone who reached a conclusion before others and has to choose, repeatedly, between speaking and not being understood, or staying silent and carrying the weight alone. Between moving toward what they see clearly and leaving others behind without meaning to, or waiting and feeling the weight of time standing still, while what they predicted continues to confirm itself all around them without them having been able to do anything. Schopenhauer touched this wound with a precision that still unsettles anyone who reads it. For him, sharper perception is not just a privilege. It is inevitably a source of particular suffering that cannot be passed on to another. Those who see more deeply also see the superficiality of a large part of the everyday interactions that most people move through without questioning. The emptiness behind certain collective certainties that every group needs to maintain in order to keep functioning. And that seeing produces a distance that is not chosen as an intellectual stance, but felt as a condition, a separation that does not disappear completely even when there is genuine connection. Because the quality of perception cannot be deactivated by goodwill. The introverted intuitive often knows what is going to happen before it happens, and that anticipation carries a weight that few people can imagine. They feel the dissolution of a deep relationship months before the final conversation that formally ends it. and they have to live with that knowledge without being able to make it stop. They perceive the falseness of a promise at the exact moment it is made, and carry the doubt of not knowing whether what they feel is real perception or unfair suspicion. They anticipate the failure of a project while everyone else is still riding the initial wave of enthusiasm. And they have to decide. Speak up and look like the one sabotaging the collective energy, or stay quiet and be the only one who knew from the very beginning. They learn to stay quiet, and the repeated silence turns into growing distance. And the accumulated distance turns into isolation that begins as a choice and progressively stops being one. And the isolation that started as protection begins to exact its own price, different from the original problem, more diffuse, deeper, harder to name. There is an image that sums up this stage well. You are at a work table, surrounded by people, and you notice a tension between two colleagues that is going to explode at some point in the coming weeks. You already know the script. You have seen this movie before. And at the same time, you are thinking, it is not my place to fix this. I was not called to do this. Why am I carrying this? And there is no satisfying answer. The perception arrived, and now it lives in you, even if you do not want it to, even if it serves no purpose in this moment. And what comes next is the point no one talks about. And that may be the most important thing said up to this point. Jung dedicated a considerable part of his work to the danger of the unintegrated psyche, to the way our most developed capacities, when they do not find the balance that comes from their opposite, begin to distort perception rather than illuminate it. When intuition operates in isolation, without the weight of concrete sensation that anchors it in the present, without verifiable thinking that tests hypotheses against reality, it begins to feed on itself instead of feeding on the real. It begins to produce internally coherent, emotionally convincing narratives, but ones that progressively lose contact with what is actually happening in the external world, outside the mind that constructs them. And then the most dangerous shift occurs. Intuition begins to become a distorted reading of reality, slowly, without announcing itself, without a clear starting point. It is a gradual slide that can go on for years without being identified by the person inside it, because it happens within the same capacity that produces genuine perceptions. So it feels real. The introverted intuitive begins to interpret neutral gestures as disguised rejection. A half-hour silence caused by genuine tiredness becomes evidence of growing emotional coldness. A change of plans for practical reasons becomes a sign of mounting disinterest. A shorter reply in a message becomes confirmation of a suspicion that had been forming for weeks without any concrete basis. At 11 at night, staring at the ceiling with a phone in hand but unable to open any conversation, because every response they imagine has 3 different interpretations and none feels safe enough to send. The mind that was supposed to be a window to the world becomes a mirror that mainly reflects the interior. And what is most disorienting is that this same mind that manufactures patterns that do not exist is the same one that, in other moments, perceives genuinely real things with precision. The same capacity that identifies what is real is also capable of constructing what is not. And the person, being inside it, cannot always tell one from the other. The line between real perception and anxious interpretation is thin, thinner than anyone likes to admit. And when you cross that line without noticing, what you see in others starts saying more about what is happening inside you than about what is happening inside them. The reading of intentions becomes a projection of fears. The anticipation of patterns becomes the construction of narratives that confirm what was already decided before any evidence. I perfectly understand how disorienting it is to not be able to tell the two apart. And the answer is neither simple nor binary. Sometimes it is real perception. Sometimes it is anxious interpretation. Most of the time, it is a combination of both in proportions that only time and honesty help identify. The ability to distinguish more consistently needs to be intentionally cultivated, with patience, with humility, with a willingness to be wrong. And no one teaches this. No personality book addresses this with sufficient clarity. Faced with the excess of perception and the growing difficulty of being understood by the external world, as the introverted intuitive does something that makes complete sense as a short-term strategy and that becomes progressively costly in the long run. They withdraw. They reduce contact. They protect the mind from more stimuli to process. The dynamics that go nowhere. The patterns no one asked them to analyze. They create distance between themselves and the world that overwhelms them. The problem is that this strategy, over time and with repetition, reinforces exactly the cycle it was trying to interrupt. The less real and consistent contact with the external world, the more the mind fills the empty spaces with interpretations built from within. Without the constant and inconvenient friction of reality, to calibrate and correct what inner perception produces, the introverted intuitive begins to live progressively inside a reality constructed and sustained exclusively by their own mind, more internally refined, more coherent on its own terms, more elaborate in its details, and at the same time more removed from what is actually happening in the real world. The external world is inconvenient, contradictory, unpredictable, full of noise and inconsistency. But it is precisely that real unpredictability, that contradiction that does not obey internal systems. That is what anchors perception and prevents it from drifting indefinitely within its own structures. It is the regular and honest contact with what exists outside the mind that prevents intuition from progressively transforming into increasingly elaborate and increasingly unverifiable internal fiction. There is a concrete sign that this process is taking place. When a person notices that their predictions about relationships and situations are becoming increasingly negative, increasingly focused on what is going to go wrong, and increasingly unverifiable because they have simply stopped exposing themselves enough for reality to confirm or refute, that is the sign. It is not that the intuition has gotten worse. It is that it ran out of real material to work with and started working with fear itself as raw material. The result looks like perception, but is a reflection. The external world becomes a mirror of the internal state, and everything that arrives from outside appears to confirm what the mind had already decided from within. The loneliness deepens, and alongside it, not a pattern emerges with greater force, one the introverted intuitive knows intimately but rarely names clearly. Overanalysis as a dead-end loop. The mind that perceives in layers cannot stop analyzing while there is anything that has not been fully understood. And there always is. A conversation ends and continues inside the head with a life of its own. What exactly did he mean by that phrase? Why did he use that specific tone and not another? What did the pause before answering mean? What has changed in the quality of the relationship since the last time they met? Analysis produces questions. Questions produce more analysis, and the loop closes on itself without a natural exit, without a point at which it is possible to say, I understand enough, now I act. Action is suspended. The decision is not made. The response is not sent. And the step is not taken. The project does not begin. Because there is always one more layer that needs to be unpacked before being able to act with enough confidence. And the next layer always reveals another one underneath it. Schopenhauer describes something that resonates here with an uncomfortable precision. The will, when it finds no expression and movement in the external world, turns against the very individual who harbors it. The energy that should drive action and create presence in the world begins to consume itself internally in circular rumination that produces no definitive conclusions, in endless preparation for an action that never truly gets started. The mind begins to devour itself with its own instruments. And the more intelligent the mind, the more elaborate and convincing the reasons it produces to justify the paralysis. It is a mind that operates on such a high level of abstraction that the concrete always seems premature. There is always one more layer to understand before acting. There is always the possibility that an additional round of analysis will reveal something critical that has not yet been seen. And while this happens on the inside, life passes on the outside. Not because the person does not want to enter it, but because entry never feels sufficiently prepared. If you are enjoying this content, check the first comment for our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes. But there is a pattern even deeper than this one, and it changes everything when it is named. The introverted intuitive learns, and over time and through the disappointments that confirmed what they predicted, to use intuition not predominantly to create, but to protect themselves in advance. The perception that could be the engine of a creative and connected life begins to be used primarily as a system of preventive defense, to identify where disappointment will come before investing emotionally, to map exit routes before fully committing, to build solid internal arguments against engagement before trying anything new and potentially painful. They anticipate rejection before showing the work they created with care and vulnerability. They anticipate abandonment before truly getting attached to someone who seems worth the risk. They anticipate failure before starting with the commitment that would be necessary to have a real chance. And because they do this with reasonable precision part of the time, because the intuition genuinely works, the patterns they identify are frequently real, they begin to confuse compulsive protection with practical wisdom and emotional maturity. They begin to believe that not investing is strategic intelligence when in reality it is fear that is too sophisticated to be recognized as fear by the one who feels it. What looks like wisdom from the inside is, in the results it produces, an elaborate form of preventive self-sabotage. The person is so completely occupied managing protection against possible futures that they cannot inhabit the real present with enough openness for it to produce anything worth remembering. They invest less and less in relationships because they already know, from old patterns projected onto the new, how they will probably end. They start fewer and fewer projects because they have already mapped all the obstacles that will arise and all the ways it can go wrong. The intuition, which could be an extraordinary advantage for life, turns into a mechanism of anticipatory paralysis that seems completely reasonable from the inside, but that from the outside results in a life that is progressively smaller and more contained than what would have been possible. And there is one dimension that is probably the hardest to face, honestly. The paradox that Jung identified with precision, and that touches a wound the introverted intuitive rarely admits even to themselves. The same type that has an extraordinary ability to identify the shadows of others, the unspoken fears hiding behind aggressiveness, the disguised motivations behind performative generosity, the patterns driving behaviors that the person themselves does not even realize they have. That same type is often blind to their own shadow at a depth proportional to their capacity to see in others, as if all the energy of perception were directed outward and the interior were, paradoxically, less examined than the exterior. The one who sees the most in others may be exactly the one who sees the least in themselves. Jung called the shadow the repressed and unrecognized aspects of the psyche, the contents that the person has not integrated into their conscious identity, and which, for that reason, are projected outward, readily recognized in others, but not recognized as one's own. We all have a shadow. We all project to some degree. But the introverted intuitive carries a specific risk here, precisely because their core identity is built around being the one who sees what others do not see, admitting that they also project, that they also have systematic blind spots, that they also distort reality in ways they do not perceive. That is not accepting a limitation. It is a threat to the entire identity. The result is judgments that disguise themselves as sharp discernment, and that are sometimes as severe as they are unfair. Deeply asymmetrical relationships where they analyze the other person with a magnifying glass precision that never turns on themselves with the same intensity. A rigidity that presents itself with every appearance of clarity of values, but that frequently has roots older than it seems. And a specific and painful difficulty in receiving back the same quality of perception they direct toward the world. Because when someone reads them accurately, when they name something they had not admitted, The discomfort is immense, and the defensive reaction is proportional. Because for the introverted intuitive, perception is not just a skill they use when useful. It is an identity built over an entire lifetime. It is the central story that organizes everything around it. I am the one who sees what others do not see. And when that becomes the cornerstone of who they are, any threat to that narrative, being wrong in an analysis they felt certain about, missing something that later turns out to be important, being misread by someone they thought they knew well, is not a minor, recoverable failure. It is a crisis that questions not just the specific mistake, but the fundamental validity of who they believe themselves to be. The person stops being someone who perceives and becomes someone who constantly needs to demonstrate and prove that they perceive. They seek external validation for their intuition in ways they do not recognize as a need. They get defensive when someone disagrees with their reading of a situation. They invest significant energy in demonstrating that they were right, even when that serves no practical purpose for anyone involved. The gift progressively transforms into a compulsive performance of the self, rather than simply being exercised naturally. This shows up in very concrete ways in daily life. And it is the moment you send someone a message explaining your reading of a situation they did not ask for, just because you need someone to confirm you saw correctly. It is the disproportionate irritation when someone disagrees with an analysis you made about a person or a dynamic. It is the quiet sense of triumph when time confirms what you had predicted. And at the same time, the awareness that this triumph serves no purpose beyond feeding the identity. It does not bring anyone closer. It builds nothing. It merely confirms what you already knew about yourself. And beneath all of this structure, over years of operating in this dynamic without it being named, a very specific kind of exhaustion accumulates. It is the deep exhaustion of someone who has carried too much weight for too long, alone, and the weight of constantly processing what others do not process without that being seen or acknowledged, of perceiving what no one asked for and that often no one wants to know, and having nowhere to put it, of inhabiting an interior that is denser and more demanding than most of the surrounding interactions can hold. Jung observed that the psyche that finds no expression for what it perceives begins to lose vitality slowly, in ways that take time to become recognizable. It is a slow erosion of genuine and spontaneous curiosity, of the desire to engage with the world with real openness. The person continues to function, continues to perceive with the same acuity or even greater acuity. But they begin to feel, in ways they cannot fully articulate, that the weight of what they perceive has long since exceeded the pleasure of perceiving. That the depth that seemed for so many years to be a gift has begun to function as a progressively thicker and more difficult isolation to cross in any direction. This is where many people with this profile arrive without being able to name it. It is the moment when depth starts to feel like a problem rather than an advantage. When the person catches themselves wishing sometimes that they could just be superficial for a day, not have to process everything, not have to carry the weight of what they perceive, be able to be in a conversation without the mind going underneath and behind and between the lines. That wish is not weakness. It is the sign of a system that is overloaded and asking for balance. Not erasure, not permanent superficiality, but rest, space, the possibility of choosing when to go deep and when to simply be. Yet the concrete version of this can be as small as sitting in a coffee shop, listening to music through headphones, and noticing that 3 minutes passed without analyzing anything. Just listening, just feeling the warmth of the cup in your hand. 3 minutes without going underneath, and feeling that it was, strangely, a relief. And it makes complete sense that you have made it this far carrying all of this without having the precise words for what was happening. Naming it is the real first step. Because once named, what was diffuse takes on shape, and what has shape can be transformed. What has been described up to now is only the surface of what happens when perception is not inhabited with awareness. What lies beneath, and what can be done about it, is what comes next. We have arrived at the core of what this video wants to offer. Not how to erase the perception, not how to become someone less deep or less sensitive, but how to inhabit the gift without being consumed by it. How to be who you are without it costing you everything you have over time. The first necessary and liberating distinction is between genuine intuition and anxious interpretation. It can be developed, but it requires attention to a quality that most people with this profile never learn to observe consciously. Genuine intuition has a particular and recognizable texture. It is quiet, direct. It does not compulsively seek external confirmation to feel real. It arrives as a clarity that settles without urgency or drama and remains stable even when it is not immediately validated by concrete evidence or by the agreement of others. It does not need to convince anyone. It does not need to be internally debated for hours. When you have to repeatedly talk yourself into an intuition, when you defend it internally with elaborate arguments before anyone has even questioned it, that is the sign that it may not be intuition in the deepest sense. Anxious interpretation has a completely different texture. It is restless, repetitive, builds narratives that grow and expand with each analysis instead of stabilizing into a final form. It has urgency. It needs to be resolved now, confirmed or denied immediately. It cannot tolerate uncertainty. It searches for evidence to confirm what it already decided before having sufficient evidence. And almost always, when looked at honestly and from some distance, it carries a prior emotional charge that fuels it. An old fear that has learned to disguise itself as perception, an unhealed wound that overlays the current situation as if it were an objective reading of it. Learning to distinguish the two permanently transforms the relationship with one's own perception. It starts with a direct and honest question. Is what I am feeling right now quiet or restless? Is it something that arrived, or is it something I'm actively constructing as I analyze? Is it stabilizing over time, or is it growing every time I come back to it? There is a simple practice that helps develop this discernment over time. When a strong perception arrives, about a person, about a situation, about a dynamic that seems to be forming, write it down somewhere without immediately acting on it. Let a few hours pass, sometimes a few days, then come back to what you wrote. If the perception is still there, quiet, clear, without urgency, it is more likely to be real. If it has grown, branched out, generated 5 new hypotheses and urgently needs confirmation, it is more likely to be anxious interpretation feeding on itself. This practice does not eliminate error, but it systematically reduces how often you act from fear disguised as intuition. The second skill, possibly the most transformative for this profile, is learning to perceive without being compelled to react to everything that is perceived, without being swept away by every perception as if it were an urgent matter demanding an immediate response. This is not denial of what was perceived. It is a distinction that most people with this profile never receive help developing. The introverted intuitive who perceives tension in a group of people does not need to immediately carry that tension as their personal responsibility, does not need to resolve it, publicly name it, or act on it in any way. The experienced physician learns, over years of clinical practice, to identify symptoms with precision without collapsing in the face of every case that presents itself. The perception becomes useful information that can be used when and if it is appropriate, rather than a burden that needs to be processed immediately. Not because the doctor became insensitive, but because they developed the ability to observe clearly without fusing with what they observe. To perceive is to receive information. What you do with that information, or whether you decide to do anything at all, is a separate choice that can be exercised consciously, with judgment, with time. Silencing a perception for now, deciding not to act on it today, is not denial of what was seen. It is genuine psychological maturity. It is the difference between a mind dragged along by everything it processes and a mind that actively governs what it does with what it processes. Seeing without being enslaved to what you see is a real form of freedom. And it is available. And then we arrive at what Jung pointed to consistently throughout his work. the return to the body and to the present as genuine anchoring. The introverted intuitive lives predominantly in the world of possibilities, invisible patterns, the deep structures that sustain the visible, of what could be and what will probably be across different scenarios. That is their natural habitat, where their mind functions with the greatest agility and richness. But inhabiting it exclusively, without any consistent grounding in the concrete and the present, is precisely what transforms the gift into drift, depth into a floating without ground that progressively loses contact with the real. Jung described the need to integrate the capacities that this type tends to ignore: concrete and immediate sensation, factual and verifiable thinking, the present that can be experienced directly, not as a betrayal of the intuitive profile, but as the ground without which depth cannot be sustained across an entire lifetime. Intuition without roots floats indefinitely. With roots, it truly dives. It goes deep, because it has a place to start from and a place to return to. The body is one of those roots, not as a philosophical concept, as a concrete and daily practice that can begin right now. The weight of the ground under your feet at this moment, the quality of your breathing right now, the actual temperature of the air, the tension in your shoulders that you only notice when you slow down enough to truly feel what is in the body. These are data points that the intuitive mind habitually ignores or dismisses as trivial, because they seem irrelevant compared to the deep structures it is busy mapping. But these are precisely the simple and immediate data points that return perception to the concrete present, that interrupt the cycle of circular analysis before it goes too deep. The present is not the enemy of depth, means it is the ground that sustains it. There is an enormous difference between someone who has depth and cannot get out of it, and someone who has depth and can choose when to enter it. The first is trapped. The second is free. And freedom, in this case, does not come from erasing the depth. It comes from developing the ability to also be on the surface when that is what the moment calls for. To be in a simple conversation without needing to turn it into analysis. To appreciate a moment without already calculating when it is going to end. And even to trust someone without the mind already automatically mapping the ways in which that could go wrong. That is not naivety. It is the ability to choose the level of engagement instead of always being pulled toward the deepest one. And I'm not saying this to cause pain. I am saying it because you deserve to hear it honestly. Depth needs ground to keep being depth and not become drift. The wide view needs roots to keep being vision and not become a progressively more elaborate illusion. The gift of seeing far needs the cultivated and practiced ability to come back, to the body, to the present, to the concrete, to what is here now instead of what might be somewhere else. Because what is at stake has never been erasing what you see. It has never been becoming less than you are. Those who try to erase perception lose what is most singular and most valuable in themselves. And that is not the path. The question is entirely different. Learning to carry what you see with genuine lightness instead of as a burden that grows heavier with every passing year. It is the real difference between inhabiting the gift and being inhabited by it. The introverted intuitive who learns to distinguish real intuition from anxious interpretation more consistently, who develops the ability to perceive without being compelled to react to every perception with urgency, who finds concrete and workable ways to anchor themselves in the present without abandoning the depth that defines them. That person becomes something genuinely rare in this world, not just someone who sees deeply, who perceives what others do not perceive, who arrives at conclusions before time confirms them, but someone who does all of that and still manages to live well, who transforms perception into real presence in life and in relationships, rather than into progressively thicker isolation, who uses vision as an instrument of genuine connection and creation, rather than exclusively as a system of preventive defense against a world that has not yet fully revealed itself. That path exists. It is not simple. It is not linear. There are setbacks, and there are moments when the old weight comes back with force and seems to have come back to stay. But it begins with real honesty about what is actually happening, and you are already at that beginning, if you have made it this far. What changes when this path starts to be walked is not dramatic to see from the outside. It is not a visible transformation, not a personality overhaul. It is more subtle. It is the difference between being in a conversation and already leaving it at the same time versus being in a conversation for real, present, on without the mind having already gone off to analyze what happened before the conversation is even over. It is the difference between showing your work with a racing heart waiting for the confirmed rejection versus showing your work knowing it can be received in ways you did not predict, and being able to tolerate that uncertainty without having already built an exit. These are small freedoms, but accumulated, they change the quality of what is possible to live. Before closing, a question worth taking with you beyond this video. One worth returning to when the mind starts picking up speed again and the analysis starts running in circles. Are you using your vision to build something real? Connection, creation, understanding, presence in the world? Or is it using you? Consuming the energy that could go toward life, and feeding analyses that lead nowhere, protecting against risks that never needed to be managed with this much intensity? That is not a rhetorical question. It is a real question, one that deserves an honest answer. And that answer may be different today than it was yesterday. If this content resonated with you, consider joining the membership community where we have exclusive videos. See you next time.